From battle to victory. Welcome to the conflict of centuries, or great conflict or great controversy, in the words of Daniel. Daniel's experience in chapter 10 means a lot to us Seventh-day Adventists, because the two most outstanding contributions of our church to Christian theology are the vision of the great controversy between Christ and Satan, which is revealed in a definite form in the gospel that God revealed in His sanctuary. Thanks to the spirit of prophecy, we have a much more encompassing view of this great cosmic conflict. That conflict is in the Bible, but many have not been able to perceive its full dimension. With God's vision of the great conflict between Christ and Satan, between heaven and earth, where the prince of darkness was confined, we can read the stories of the Bible in a dimension that goes far beyond what we see in the human conflicts. As individuals, families, churches, societies, nations, and empires, we are engaged in a spiritual battle that we cannot avoid, whether we know it or not. And it is important that we understand the nature of that conflict so that we can understand what often happens to us, who to turn to for protection, and how to turn to the winning side. Let us consider the diet of Daniel during the 70 years of captivity. Daniel grieves for 3 weeks, this time not for not understanding the word or vision, but for grasping the tremendous confrontation between good and evil angels who try to influence pagan kings in matters that affect God's people. In those 3 weeks, Daniel did not eat any special delicacies or meat, nor drink wine. Some have wondered if Daniel really ate meat and drank wine, because he rejected these meals from the king's table when he arrived in Babylon. Ellen G. White wrote the following regarding the custom of Daniel and his companions in Jerusalem before being taken captive to Babylon. They decided that as flesh meat had not composed their diet in the past, it should not come into their diet in the future, and as wine had been prohibited to all who should engage in the service of God, they determined that they would not partake of it. The slides that you can see in the screen do not represent the humble attitude the 3 valiant Hebrews and Daniel had when requesting not to eat the meal of the king. The pictures try to simply represent the decision of not being contaminated with the table of the Babylonian court. The fate of the son of Aaron, says Ellen G. White, had been presented before them, and they knew that the use of wine would confuse their senses, that the indulgence of appetite would becloud their powers of discernment. These particulars were placed on record in the history of the children of Israel as a warning to every youth to avoid all customs and practices and indulgences that would in any way dishonor God. This statement regarding wine is clear. It doesn't mean that once established in Babylon, without relying on the king's table, Daniel did not drink non-fermented wine. But what can we say about meat before a text that says he didn't taste meat or wine for 3 weeks, suggesting that he at least ate meat from time to time? Had he practiced a diet without any kind of meat in Jerusalem? It seems difficult to draw such a conclusion because God had allowed His people to eat clean meat, and only unclean meats were forbidden. In addition, God also required in His ritual law to eat, in the case of the priest, the sacrifice for sins. The priest ate also the peace sacrifices together with the people, which were roasted in the temple. This was as true in Jerusalem as when they lived in the wilderness, when God gave them manna from heaven to eat. After studying all the statements of Ellen G. White on meat, I find the following options to explain this apparent inconsistency. First point, that in Ellen G. White's day, when Texas did not yet belong to the United States, the most heavily consumed meat in the North was pork. There were no refrigerated trucks to transport beef from the South, and they came north simply like dead animals. By the term meat, many understood pork, even today. Beef they understood as bovine meat, as many still do today. If you go to a buffet and see meat, it will almost certainly be pork, but if you see beef, it will be bovine meat. Consequently, when Ellen G. White says that meat was not part of Daniel's diet before going to Babylon, she is referring to the pork that was served on the king's table, and moreover to meat sacrificed to idols whose blood had not been drained as required by the Levitical law. Let us read under this context the following explanatory quotation of the Spirit of Prophecy. In the food provided for the king's table were swine's flesh and other meats, which were pronounced unclean by the law given through Moses. She mentioned this in the year 1903. Another statement. As a true Hebrew, he, Daniel, could not eat the meat nor drink the wine. According to the religious ideas of the day, this act consecrated the whole to the heathen gods. Daniel and his three brethren thought that if they should not actually partake of the king's bounty, a mere pretense of eating the food and drinking the wine where such idolatry was practiced would be a denial of their faith. To do this would be to implicate themselves with heathenism and to dishonor the law of God. She wrote this in 1907. We have to keep in mind a second point, that neither in the wilderness where God gave his people food prepared by angels, nor in all their history did meat constitute the basis of the food of their people. The strongest statements she had against meat were given in the context of pastors whose diet was carnivorous, where meat was the regular dish, and they were carnivore dependent. In contexts like this, a radical cut was necessary until they could be freed from that addiction. The next statement, written by Ellen G. White when she had already entered her sixth decade, seems to correspond to the way she and Adventists at large understood vegetarianism. In that quotation, we see that she considered Seventh-day Adventists who ate meat moderately to be vegetarians, as meat did not occupy the principal item of their meal. To say that they were vegetarians was the same as saying that the basis of their diet was not meat. Here's her statement. As a denomination, we are in the fullest sense total abstainers from the use of spirituous liquors, wine, beer, cider, and also tobacco, and all narcotics, and are earnest workers in the cause of temperance. All are vegetarians, many abstaining wholly from the use of flesh food, while others use it in only the most moderate degree. She wrote this in 1894. This is in harmony with what she practiced even 11 years later, well into her seventh decade, where there are records that she ate fish. That is the reason why her grandson Arthur White, in his monumental biographical work of his grandmother, concluded that in her days, James and Ellen White, having accepted health reform, were vegetarians. But this did not preclude the occasional use of some meat, especially when non-meat articles were not easily available. Ellen White took a positive stand in Australia in 1896, and from that time onward, no meat appeared on her table. This soon included fish and fowl. When considering precisely what Ellen White ate and checking to see if this accorded with the main body of her teachings, the time, place, circumstances, and the foods available to her should be taken into account. The reader must keep in mind that there was not easy to simple refrigeration, nor were there the cereal breakfast foods or vegetable protein foods we know so well in existence. A third point. This does not mean that the Eden diet was not the best, and Daniel knew it, no doubt. He knew that diet that God gave to our first parents, as clearly stated in Genesis. Faced with such a situation in the pagan court where he had to live, he may have resorted to that diet to keep his spiritual senses well awake and not be swept away by the wave of worldliness existing there. Therefore, his example serves especially for us today when the condition of meats with all the pesticides that affect animals and requires greater caution when deciding whether or not to eat meat. Being at the gates of eternity, of living in the new Eden, where there will be no death or humans or animals, it is our duty and privilege to exhort the people to prepare to dwell with the angels of God. The vision of the man dressed in linen. This is the section, the most important section of chapter 10. When I was 14 years old, I asked God to call me to be a prophet. I wanted to be able to see Jesus and his angels. But I had no clear idea about the role of the prophets and how difficult it is to be a prophet. So today I don't know whether to thank God for not responding to my prayer. Daniel in his last vision felt weakened and fell to the floor semi-fainting when a man dressed in plain linen appeared to him in vision. The figure of that heavenly being was so imposing that those who were with him were frightened and fled, but they didn't see the man dressed in linen that Daniel saw. This reminds us of the vision of Saul of Tarsus on his way to Damascus. Paul later recounted it. My companions saw the light, but they did not understand the voice of him who was speaking to me. Acts 22, verse 9. How many times that happens in our lives? People realize that we are different, but they cannot understand the reason. And while many may admire the different kind of life we have, it is only truly understood by those who convert to the Lord, who live the same experience. Daniel sees the favorite personage in his prophecies dressed in the typical high priest clothes of the Day of Atonement. Indeed, during the year, priests wore fine linen robes to officiate in the temple, Exodus 28, verse 39. The Hebrew word is shesh. But on the Day of Atonement, the high priest wore his four undergarments, all made of simple linen. The word in Hebrew is bad, Leviticus 16:4. As when the priest remove the ashes from the altar during the year, Leviticus 6:10. In other words, plain linen clothing was used to remove temple ashes and impurities. We may read Leviticus 16 verses 23 and 24, when again the simple linen is mentioned in the elimination of sin from the midst of the people of Israel. Daniel also sees that the being wore a garment that had the same texture used on the Day of Atonement. Upon his lower clothes, the high priest put on his superior garments, which included a gold belt, Exodus 28:18. In addition, the future priest of the new covenant seen by Daniel was to be king also, which could imply that the gold belt of the being dressed in linen represented a higher rank. Daniel sees the man dressed in plain linen again, the word Hebrew is bad, at the conclusion of the vision in connection with the time of the end, Daniel 12 verses 5 to 9. Thus, we can see again that this heavenly being seen by Daniel in chapter 8, whom he called the Prince of the Hosts and Prince of Princes, is the same heavenly being. As a matter of fact, he performs a continuous intercession in his temple, which proves that he performs a priestly role. When the vision reaches its climax in the time of the end, that celestial prince, dressed in the clothes of the Day of Atonement, points us again the time when his sanctuary in heaven is to be cleansed. Then Gabriel intervenes and restores the strength of the prophet. The angel tells him that he is much loved in heaven for trying to understand the prophetic messages that God was giving him for his people and for the final time. The angel also reveals to him the spiritual battles between the angels of good and evil to influence the minds of monarchs. These battles are so intense that at one point, Michael, one of the chief princes who saw Daniel, but who is superior to Gabriel, came to his help. Michael is the true prince of God's people, as seen in chapter 12, that we will study in the last week of this quarterly. While Satan was striving to influence the highest powers in the kingdom of Medo-Persia to show disfavor to God's people, says Ellen G. White, angels worked in behalf of the exiles. The controversy was one in which all heaven was interested. Through the prophet Daniel, we are given a glimpse of this mighty struggle between the forces of good and the forces of evil. For 3 weeks, Gabriel wrestled with the powers of darkness, seeking to counteract the influence at war on the mind of Cyrus. And before the contest closed, Christ himself came to Gabriel's aid. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, Gabriel declares. But lo, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me. And I remained there with the kings of Persia. Daniel 10, verse 13. All that heaven could do in behalf of the people of God was done. The victory was finally gained. The forces of the enemy were held in check all the days of Cyrus and all the days of his son Cambyses, who reigned about 7.5 years. Let us read other statements of the spirit of prophecy in regard to the struggles between good and evil angels to influence human minds. Terrible is the struggle that takes place between the forces of good and of evil in important centers where the messengers of truth are called upon to labor. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, declares Paul, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, Ephesians 6:12. Till the close of time, there will be a conflict between the Church of God and those who are under the control of evil angels. Another statement. There is a strife between the forces of good and evil, between the loyal and the disloyal angels. Christ and Satan are not an agreement, and they never will be. In every age, the true Church of God has engaged in decided warfare against satanic agencies. Until the controversy is ended, the struggle will go on between wicked angels and wicked people on the one side, and holy angels and true believers on the other. In the host of evil there is jarring and discord, but they are all firm allies in fighting against heaven. Their own aim is to disparage God, and their great numbers lead them to entertain the hope that they will be able to dethrone omnipotence. We should ever keep in mind that unseen agencies are at work, both evil and good, to take the control of the mind. They act with unseen yet effectual power. Good angels are ministering spirits, exerting a heavily influence upon hardened mind, while the great adversary of souls, the devil and his angels, are continually laboring to accomplish our destruction. Let's not sleep, because everyone who sleeps on a battlefield will meet the lost. In their last desperate struggle, the evil angels gather the world for the ultimate battle, Armageddon. In this context, the Lord tells us in the book of Revelation, "Look, I come like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake and remains clothed, so as not to go naked and be shamefully exposed." So be it. Amen.